Hello and welcome to A House Divided, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptison, and I will be the host for today's live stream event. Now, pardon me for just a second while I make sure that everything is working the way I expect it to. Here we go. And I'm going to introduce you to our guest in just a moment here. But let me do a little bit of housekeeping, as we always do on A House Divided before we start. I want to have everybody understand that while you're going to get a chance to meet Dr. Robert K.D. Colby in just a moment, what you're doing is you're not just watching us have a historical interview. I think you're going to enjoy it. This is a book signing. This is a book signing party. And we are working on, shall we call this, we are dropping an unholy traffic today. This is the drop party for unholy traffic. But this is a book signing party. So we are going to, you're watching us stream this live on our Facebook account. There's going to be a link in the comments. You can click right through that link and you can get to our website, alincolnbookshop.com. You can order a copy of An Unholy Traffic, and Dr. Colby has already very generously signed one of our custom book plates for you, and we will ship it out to you. So just as if it were 50 years ago and you went to a book signing and the author was sitting there in the bookshop and you stood in the line and you bought yourself a signed first edition copy of, gosh, I don't know, Robert, what was a good book 50 years ago? That maybe Thomas Lawrence Connolly.
That's great.
Army of the
The Marble
Heartland.
Man.
Marble Man. Maybe you get yourself a signed first edition of Marble Man. The easiest way to get a signed first edition book at the lowest price is to buy it when it's new. If you want a signed first edition of Gone with the Wind, then just jump in a time machine and go back to Atlanta in 1930s, and Peggy Mitchell will sign you a copy. You won't have to pay $3,000 to anybody to get your signed copy. So this is what we're doing today. It's a book signing party. It's a book signing program, and you will get a chance to ask Robert Colby questions about An Unholy Traffic, and you can do that by leaving your questions in the comments section of this Facebook feed. And I'll probably check them out about halfway through our conversation, maybe about 25 minutes from now. Now, before we get to the book, let me introduce you to our author, Robert K.D. Colby. Dr. Robert K.D. Colby is an assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi. He's the recipient of the Allen Nevins Prize from the Society of American Historians. He did receive that prize for research on the domestic slave trade, which is good because that's what we're going to talk about today with An Unholy Traffic. The book we're talking about, I showed it to you before, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, from Oxford University Press, published in 2024, 344 pages, illustrations, maps, notes, bibliographies, all that good stuff. And it costs $35. Buy the book, order it, we'll send you a signed copy. Now, if you're watching this video after the live event, perhaps tomorrow or the day after it, we're going to throw this up on YouTube, so you might be watching it on our YouTube channel. We will still have signed copies available for you. There's going to be a link in the description of the YouTube video. So still get in there, order the book, and we will send you a copy. Thank you very much for bearing with me. Robert K.D. Colby, welcome to A House Divided. Thank you for making time for us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Sure. And this book was recommended to me by a mutual friend of ours, Dr. John White at Christopher Newport University. And I don't know to say oddly or not, but just about as soon as John recommended it to me, everybody I know that does history on the internet had a copy. And everybody I know, as soon as they cracked it, started getting really excited. Now, I don't have internet data. I just know if my friends who do this get crazy nerded out about something, and they are. They all seem to be losing it. This is a really, even before we talk about the book, this is such an exciting idea for a book, Robert. So it's a book about the slave trade during the Civil War. What turned you on to that idea that we needed to talk about the slave trade as something that happened in the Civil War?
Yeah, I think it's something that I saw as an absence. When I started looking at this book, I was in grad school. I was looking for a topic to ultimately do a dissertation about, and I was starting to work. I was starting my graduate work at this moment when people were publishing a lot of really exciting books about the domestic slave trade before the Civil War. People like Walter Johnson, Ed Baptist, and there a whole host of others. There was about a decade and a half of book after book about the domestic slave trade before the Civil War. And very few of those books carried into the Civil War period at all. If they did, there was sort of a token, a token mention. And I thought, okay, well, that this makes sense. The slave trade shouldn't have survived during the Civil War. The Civil War wrecks the cotton economy that those books were fundamentally about. The Civil War causes all these economic problems in the Confederacy, and of course, sitting from our perspective in the 21st century, we also know emancipation is going to happen.
Mhm.
And so I thought, surely there was not much of a slave trade during the Civil War. And then I got into the records and I started coming across example after example of transactions in people that took place during the Civil War. And pretty soon I thought, there might be something here. But every time it felt like, and it's not literally true, but it felt like it was true every time I opened a book of Civil War letters, or I went into the archive or to the Library of Congress or the National Archives. It felt like I was coming across more and more examples of transactions and people that, by all the sort of post Civil War logic, shouldn't have been happening. um, and so I just felt I felt like this was something that needed to be explored and explained, to see what it tells us about the Civil War.
Yeah, I was gonna, yeah, I, saying that sort of gave me this idea. I wanted to ask you this before, but to what extent is an Unholy Traffic a Civil War book?
It's a great question. I think it is both a Civil War book and a book about the history of slavery in the United States. And I wanted
They
to
don't;
write it
those
in
two
part.
topics don't often intertwine.
No,
No.
no, and they really should. And there certainly are excellent books that make those connections. I'm thinking of, the one of the best is Amy Merle Taylor's Embattled Freedom, for example. But I did think, as I was writing this, these are two audiences or two topics that don't always talk directly to one another. And one of the goals that I had in writing this book was to have that conversation, to see where the conversations that historians of slavery are having, where do those intersect with the conversations that Civil War historians are having? So, well, we can talk about some of those intersections, but I thought it was important to bring those two conversations together.
Sure, sure. And certainly people that are talking about the slave trade and stop the story before the war starts are going to miss out on what you get from soldier letters,
Hmm.
and especially
Hmm.
all of the Northerners now going south by the hundreds of thousands and reporting back what they're seeing
Right,
uh,
right.
from their point of view. Um, Now, let let me start first part of the conversation. I don't want to spend too much time in the buildup to the Civil War because I want to
Hmm.
get into the
Hmm.
Civil War.
Hmm.
Uh, but briefly talk about what are the elements of the slave trade as it leads up to the Civil War. We know
Sure.
that, James Hammond is going to tell us that cotton is king and nothing can ever
Mhm.
mess with the slave trade. But so what does it look like with war looming?
Sure. So the domestic slave trade had evolved across the 19th century fairly dramatically. The domestic slave trade is basically the exchange, the purchase, the sale, and the movement of enslaved people within the United States, as opposed to the transatlantic slave trade, which is the importation of enslaved people from Africa to the New World colonies. And the domestic slave trade rises in large part because the United States closes its involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, or its legal involvement in the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, as the Constitution permitted. The domestic slave trade essentially arises in large part to facilitate, though, as you mentioned, Bjorn, the emergence of the cotton kingdom. As cotton becomes more and more profitable as a global commodity, as more and more Southerners grow it in more and more places, cotton planters in places like Alabama, Georgia, eventually Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, eventually Texas, have an enormous amount of demand for labor, and enslaved laborers can be used more profitably in those places than they can in, for example, Virginia or Maryland or Kentucky, North Carolina, places where slavery had been long established but was less profitable than it had been before, and certainly less profitable than was the case on the cotton and the sugar frontiers in southern Louisiana as well. And so essentially, the domestic slave trade exists because a slaveholder in Louisiana is willing to pay more for a person than a person in Virginia, than that person is worth to a person in Virginia, for example. And so over the course of the 19th century, we don't know an exact number, but somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people are sold for the most part, from the older slaveholding states of Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and so forth, to the cotton frontier. And this continues right up until the edge of the Civil War. The slave trade evolves; it grows more sophisticated. It financing develops alongside sort of the um, maturing system of American finance, for example. Slave traders who had once walked people from Virginia to Mississippi now can put them on trains and steamboats. So there's an extraordinary amount of evolution in the slave trade, but the overarching tendency of movement from the Atlantic seaboard to the Cotton Kingdom remains the defining principle headed into the Civil War.
Right. And to some extent, and I also want to clarify, or at least for myself, understand that even the people who are involved in the trade, in the slave trade,
Mhm.
are supporters of bans or controls on the international slave trade, and they have a preference domestic for the domestic trade.
Yeah.
Am I right about that?
So for the most part, I haven't seen a lot of for to the degree that I've been able to read professional slave traders, and I should say, to make the slave trade happen, a class of professional slave traders grows up in the 19th century. People who make a living buying people in one part of the South and selling them in another. Have never seen any evidence that any of them are involved, for example, in the movement to reopen the African slave trade in the 1850s. They certainly profit enormously from the limitation of the supply of enslaved people to the people already present in the United States.
Right, right. And so some of the most important characters in this book, the people who you find, are the people in that trade. Like up till
Mhm,
now, I've been talking about the customers, but it
mhm.
is the people that run the trade, the dealers, and they have very specific stories. So one of the great things about this book for you at home is Dr. Colby gets into so many uh stories of the practical aspects of the trade. And of course, you could have written a book that was mostly quantitative analysis, and there's plenty of data for that. But the book is filled with great stories. The stories. So tell us a little bit about uh, the life and livelihood of the men who worked in this trade.
Yeah, so this was a highly lucrative, but also a highly competitive business. A lot of the men who dominate the slave trade or dominate the slave trade as it appears in this book had gotten their starts. That they're men in their late 40s, 50s, even early 60s at this point. Many of them had gotten their start slave trading in the 1830s, which is the absolute most lucrative time to do so in American history. What you have for the most part is people who the slave traders I focus on are major merchants who live in cities like Richmond or Charleston. They are auctioneers and what are called commission merchants, which means that they never actually take ownership of an enslaved person, but a slaveholder will send a person to them to sell that person, and they keep 2 to 3, maybe the percentage grows throughout the Civil War, but at the beginning of the Civil War, it's 2 to 3% of the sale price of that person. And they also partner with generally younger men who travel throughout the countryside of a state like Virginia, trying to acquire people to sell in the Richmond market. And then they have counterparts in cities like New Orleans and Natchez who receive these people and sell them in those cities. So it's a pretty sophisticated business. There is an there The largest slave traders deal in an extraordinary volume of people. They might sell several hundred people in a month at any given point. And They are constantly, their accounting is sophisticated. Their negotiations with banks in southern cities is considerable. And it's a high information business. They're always corresponding with one another, trying to understand where prices are highest, where are areas to be avoided. It's a very mature and sophisticated business heading into the Civil War. And it's not surprising. The men who are buying and selling now are the second and third generation of people who have done this professionally.
Right. Uh, Now, another great part of this book is you absolutely do provide the other side of the coin, and tell me about, in some ways, tell me about some of your primary sources or how you found them. But uh, uh, I'm sure even the people listening to us right now are thinking to themselves, wow, are we talking about buying and selling people? We're talking about
Yes.
the trade in human flesh. And so now we've got a picture of the trade, what was the experience of the people who are chattel property
Mhm.
getting bought and sold?
Yeah, that was something I tried very hard to get at in writing this book. And there's a really rich the narratives of people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, William Wells Brown. All of the antebellum slave narratives are really rich in describing the experience of being bought and sold. And one of the things that those narratives reveal is that this is an absolutely defining reality of enslaved life. Um, the fact that I was just reading a speech by a man who escaped during the Civil War, and he talks about one of the central realities of his experience in slavery was leaving for the work assigned to him on a given day, and the possibility of coming home and having his, as he puts it, his wife gone and the door locked, having family members sold away from you with no warning whatsoever. This was absolutely a central experience. And Frederick Douglass, talks about living in dread of of oddly the person who enslaved him dying, because he knew that that would mean a reckoning and the division of families. There are enslaved people who talk about families being divided and sold based on names drawn out of a hat. It's an incredibly arbitrary, it's an incredibly sudden process, and what I found, one of the things that I found striking, is that it shapes the lives even of people who are never themselves bought and sold, because the possibility just hangs out there, is omnipresent. Enslaved people talk about the slave trade falling upon their families like a thunderbolt out of the blue sky. So it's absolutely a central reality. In fact, the existence of the slave trade means that every enslaved person constantly carries a price, functionally stamped on their person,
Mhm.
and it's entirely up to the person who enslaves them whether or not they act on that. And any enslaver can choose to do that at any moment, and outside forces like debt, like illness, um, can bring them to that at any moment. So it's absolutely a central reality of the lives of enslaved people before the Civil War, and it continues to be a central part of their reality during the Civil War.
Right. So once Fort Sumter happens, of course, I'm sure the slave traders and the enslavers of people, we know lots about how they're, looking at Abraham Lincoln and old Abe, but once Fort Sumter is over and once the fighting is started, one would think that these people would be looking to get out of the trade just
Mm.
as soon as possible. But that's not exactly what happens, is it? Um,
No.
it gets better in some ways. Am I right? Or
I would say it continues,
yeah.
right? You're absolutely right. I came into this project thinking that I would see a mass exodus of people from the slave trade. And certainly people do leave it, although many of them leave it to go into the Confederate Army, for example, right? Uh, One of the things that I was hard to sort of put a finger on the degree to which it mattered, or the degree to which it affected the slave trade during the Civil War. But to the degree that I was able to trace the experience of people who had been slave traders before the Civil War, the younger men certainly go into the Confederate military in significant numbers. So, to the degree that there's an exodus, it's not because they're not necessarily trying to get out of the business.
Mhm.
It's because they are caught up in sort of the broader project of preserving slavery that the Confederacy represents. There are what I would say though is so the wartime slave trade never quite attains the volume, I would say, of the pre-war slave trade. Um, but the reasons for that are not the reasons that I expected when I started researching this book. Put simply, the reason that it has very little to do with how confident Confederates are in the survival of the institution of slavery. Again, like it's one of those places where one of my earliest Civil War influences was Gary Gallagher, and one of the lessons that he hammered into us is you cannot read the Civil War backwards from the 21st century, right? You have to start at the beginning of the war and read it forwards, and that was something I had to continually remind myself to do, because again, looking at the Civil War backwards, you think, well, why wouldn't they be rushing to get out of the business? Because slavery is in serious trouble. And the reality is they simply don't think that. They don't think slavery is in trouble, and so the obstacles that the slave trade encounters are as I said, the movement of men into the military, and have much more to do with the financial crisis that racks the Confederacy than it does with Confederates' ideas about slavery's survival. I would say most Confederates for most of the war are convinced that slavery will survive the war intact, and that things will go back very much as they were before the Civil War. That being the case, there's a certain logic to many of them try to actually acquire people during the war, which was something I found quite striking.
Yeah. Now, the one of the reasons why they would, why slave traders and people in the slave trade would expect that slavery would continue would be the public policy of the Lincoln administration and the military at the beginning of the war that we do not intend to interfere with slavery. And certainly, if you look at in the East, if we're going to look at Alexandria, for instance, in Virginia, then there certainly is a policy that slavery is going to continue and nobody's going to bother you. But from what you write, it doesn't seem that either those policies or those expectations survive encounters with actual Union soldiers.
No, and I will confess, right, there's a sort of rich vein of scholarship in looking at the liberating effects of the Union military, and one of the things, but you're right, like, so take Alexandria, for example. Alexandria is the part of Virginia that was originally part of the District of Columbia, but was retroceded back to Virginia in the late 1840s. It's right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., which means that Union forces occupy the city as soon as Virginia legally secedes in late May 1860. Late May 1861. And one of the first things that Union forces do is they arrive at and empty one of the two major slave jails in Alexandria. They find a few people held there. In one of these sort of deep moments of Civil War irony, they let loose the enslaved people who had been confined in that jail, and they lock up Confederates that they'd captured while taking the city in that jail. And this is an experience that really repeats itself wherever the Union Army goes during the Civil War. And what I think it speaks to, right, because the Union official policies towards slavery are complicated and ever evolving. And they have to reckon with questions of loyalty. They have to reckon with sort of broader policies of how, for example, does the United States government want to treat slavery in the border states or areas where they're hoping to reconstruct or to readmit portions of, let's say, Louisiana into the United States? And in those places, they handle slavery pretty carefully. Slavery remains legal in the border states and in parts of Louisiana, Tennessee, Virginia throughout the Civil War. But on the ground, what I would say is that the presence of Union soldiers absolutely demolishes the slave trade. And the reason I think this is the case is that it's very hard to hold a person as property if no one is going to back you up when push comes to shove. So if an enslaved person can, without consequence, without local authorities raising a finger, can walk away from an enslaver, then that person, whatever the law says, has functionally ceased to be property. William Sherman says something to this effect in 1864. And so what you see is that regardless of what is sort of formally true for slavery, wherever the Union Army goes and stays, the slave trade, for all intents and purposes, dries up. You see this in New Orleans, for example. New Orleans had been the largest slave market in the antebellum South. Over the course of the 19th century, at least 100, probably closer to 150,000 people find themselves sold through New Orleans. After the arrival of Union forces in the spring of 1862, you cannot literally, but pretty close to count the number of slave transactions on one hand, even though slavery remains legal in New Orleans. And it's simply because human property is too risky an investment. If the state, the governing powers that be, will not enforce that.
Right. And I was gonna, yeah, I was good. You brought up New Orleans, and I was gonna bring up, Memphis because today being
Yeah,
June 6th, we're
right.
all commemorating D-Day. It's also, if I'm correct, the date that the
Hmm.
Federals marched into Memphis, June 6th of
Hmm.
1862. And Memphis was the most, certainly the most valuable slave market in the upper Mississippi.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and and so I think it provides a unique picture, similar to New Orleans, of an occupied city where the trade is supposed to be protected. It's
Hmm.
supposed to be going on. Uh,
Right.
but but it doesn't seem to me in the case of Memphis, from looking at your book, that it seems like the slave trade had a very difficult time in a place like Memphis, Nashville, New
Hmm.
Orleans once it was occupied.
Yeah, it's the kind of, if you told me there were a handful, I found, I can't think of any transactions in enslaved people that I found in Memphis after the arrival of Union forces. Now, if you told me that a few happened, I would believe you.
Mhm.
Um, but it's just, it's very difficult, and it's very difficult simply because um, the Union Army is it's not, maybe not yet the emancipatory force it will come to be, but it is hostile to disloyal slaveholders. Um, and Union soldiers as individuals are very reluctant to go to any effort at all to return people to slavery, which again makes buying or selling a person a risky endeavor.
Right. Now we have, I want to give a shout out. We're about halfway through our conversation, so I'm going to give a shout out to some of our friends that I know are watching. Our friends at the Civil War Breakfast Club podcasted forum, excellent Civil War nerds are watching, and they say hello. And learning about Lincoln is an account from down in Township. Is it called Macomb in Michigan? You'll need to tell me learning about Lincoln, whether it's Macomb or Macomb for the Michigan one. Okay, Jeffrey Boutwell actually though has a question though, and what we've been talking about leads up to Jeffrey's question, but his is a little more interesting because of the place he's talking about.
Okay.
Jeffrey asks us, last year I visited Forks in the Road in Natchez, the second largest domestic slave market prior to the Civil War. Did it continue to operate after the war began, and for how long?
So yes, the slave market in Natchez does continue to operate, similar to what we've been talking about in New Orleans and Memphis up until the arrival of Union forces. Slows considerably, given that Union vessels and soldiers are moving along the Mississippi River, beginning in the summer of 1862. But slave transactions do continue in Natchez until the spring of 1863. Not on as significant. Natchez had been maybe the second or third largest slave market. It's hard to say exactly. We don't have good numbers for this. No one is required to track data, and relatively few consistent accounts survive. But Natchez is significant. Slave transactions do continue there until the spring of 1863. What I would say is that there are also powerful stories in Natchez about USCT regiments recruited in the city dismantling the slave markets at forks of the road, and sort of sharing reminiscences of their purchase and sale in those places. And this is often the case. One of the things that I found, I didn't get to write about it at length in the book, but one of the things that I found is that African American soldiers regularly, when given the chance, destroy slave markets, throughout the Confederacy. Union forces generally do, but USCTs seem to highly relish the opportunity to destroy slave markets when they have the opportunity, or else, as in the case of Alexandria, to see the purposes of those slave markets reversed. There are a number of slave markets that the Union Army uses as recruiting stations for USCTs. Or One of the things that I found really striking is that if you read the letters and memoirs of Northerners who went south to work with formerly enslaved people, in many cases in Savannah, Alexandria, New Orleans, and a handful of other cities. Former slave markets become schools. And so they're for formerly enslaved people. And so there's a great, in some cases, as in Natchez, the slave markets are destroyed during the Civil War. In other places, they're repurposed, and that reappropriation is widely seized on as a sign of the war's transformative effects.
Right. Hey, we have one more question. John Willen wants to know, and I think he's anticipating where we were going with the conversation. But yeah, so let's let John ask the next question. What was the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation on the slave trade, or had the trade essentially ceased by then?
So it certainly hadn't ceased. The best evidence that I have available to me is that just before the Emancipation Proclamation, the wartime slave trade actually peaks, or is actually as robust as it had ever been. I don't have good numbers beyond January 1863 because the person who kept this account book died that month. But so at least one Richmond slave trader was basically almost hitting his antebellum numbers in the winter of 1862 to 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation, from a Confederate's perspective, has no effect whatsoever. You know those. This is the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, right? So you all are well versed in the debates over the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the critiques of the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, is that it didn't actually free anybody. Or that's the critique launched at it, and that's the line Confederates take. They look at it and they say, well, this is Abraham Lincoln freeing enslaved people who are still under our control, and it doesn't. And essentially, their perspective is that as long as we win the war, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't matter. And so there's a great deal. In fact, there's a flurry of articles in Confederate newspapers that essentially all say some variation of, look at how high the prices in our local slave auction was, and what this shows is that Lincoln's proclamation has had no effect here. Now, Northern newspapers often reprint these articles and say something along the lines of, you Confederates understand how inflation works, don't you? But nevertheless, there's very little sense that the Emancipation Proclamation matters a great deal, and it's because Confederates are doing pretty well in the fall and winter of 1862. And so, they look at Fredericksburg, for example, and they say, well, great, let Abraham Lincoln make these empty threats. We're going to win the war, and it won't matter.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite responses to the Emancipation Proclamation thing is, it sort of works out now. This isn't necessarily in your book, but down the road from where you work in Oxford, northeast from where you work, is a little town, Corinth, Mississippi, where there's a National Park Service, has the Corinth Civil War Interpretive Center, and part of that is a national park site for a contraband camp that people can visit and learn about it. And of course, that is on the 1st of January, 1863. That contraband camp is on the Mississippi side of the line. It's not in Loyal, Tennessee. It's over on the Mississippi. So at that site, at that NPS site, you should go down to Corinth and visit the interpretive center, and
it's an incredibly moving
site of the contraband camp. Those people were freed on New Year's Day, 1863, and had a celebration. That is actually an excellent example of where it happened on that day. And it wasn't just a prospective freedom,
No, and I should say, I personally take the view that it mattered a great
sure.
deal.
It's the 21st
But
century. Those were 1950s guys that talked about
right,
that
right.
that
I
it
mean,
didn't matter.
but it's as you say. I mean, there are plenty of stories of enslaved people believe it matters a great deal,
Oh
and
yeah.
of course they
Yeah.
show up in places like Corinth in large numbers beginning in January
Mm.
1863 because they know that the proclamation is taken. And I should say, the proclamation does have effects on the slave trade in Union occupied areas in interesting ways. So, for example, Burnside, when he's commanding in the Department of the Ohio, which includes part of Kentucky,
Mhm.
steps in. And so in Kentucky, of course, the slave trade remains legal. It continues to happen. The reasons I find particularly opaque, but it does continue to happen. The Union commanders in the area in Kentucky and Missouri believe thousands of people are sold in those states during the Civil War. But so Kentucky has these laws that require Kentucky. Sorry, I should say most southern states had a law that if someone is captured as a runaway, they're held for a certain period of time, and then if no one claims them, they are sold. Kentucky shortens the period of time during the war, partially because there are so many people arriving from Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi and other Confederate states. But at one point, a locality, I believe it's Nicholasville, but I could be wrong, is trying to auction off some people who are alleged to be fugitives from slavery, and the local Union commander, under the authority of Ambrose Burnside, steps in and halts the sale.
Mhm.
And this goes all the way up, and eventually it comes to Stanton and Lincoln. And Lincoln responds that yes, the Union commander was right to stop the sale, essentially because there was no proof that those people hadn't escaped from a state covered by the Emancipation Proclamation.
Mm.
And therefore, they could very well have been free people and not no longer fugitive slaves. So, in loyal areas, the Emancipation Proclamation does matter, even in the case of the slave trade.
Right. Right. Hey, I want to turn another corner here and talk about some of your sources, some of the sources.
Mhm,
And earlier we talked about the difficulty of finding the voices of the enslaved,
mhm,
and you told us about contemporary sources that did that. But you also used some of the oral histories that were created in the 20th century, which I think are
mhm, mhm.
fascinating evidence. But one of the things about those oral histories is that there are some, I guess a modern historian would call it compromises
Sure.
to the value. So, and some of that involves that the people being interviewed in the South in the 1930s live in Jim
Mhm,
Crow, and they're only
mhm.
going to say so many things to a federal interviewer when they have to leave the room and go back out into their
Right.
communities.
Right.
But and there are other issues as well, and discuss them if you think if you think it's relevant here. But what was it, on the other hand, using those 20th century oral histories where you've got somebody looking back on being
Mm,
bought and sold 80
yeah.
years before, 70 or 80 years before?
Yeah. So we're talking about these interviews that interviewers employed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s performed with formerly enslaved people, or people whom they believed to have been formerly enslaved. And so, yeah, as you say, Bjorn, we're talking about interviews that are taking place more than 70 years after the Civil War. And historians have gone back and forth about the relative merits of using these interviews. And I can only say I tried to use them very carefully. That is to say, there are um, memories of the slave trade appear in a preponderance of these interviews. I think in many cases, interviewers asked specifically whether the formerly enslaved people remembered people being bought and sold, and they usually say that they do. I I pretty much only used specific memories that were detailed, and I that I couldn't just sort of attribute to a sort of a broad cultural memory. Memories that were detailed, memories that described specific experiences, um, and particularly experiences that were that were clearly correlated with wartime events. Many of the interviewees, for example, discuss where they were when they found out that they were free. And so they will often talk about either themselves or family members being sold in relation to when that took place. It was a year or two before freedom came, things like that. And so I tried to limit myself in terms of which of those experiences I use because I want to be careful. What I will say is, though, on the flip side, there are times when it is very clear that these WPA narratives, the lingering effects of the slave trade come through very clearly. There was one interview that took place in Virginia, for example, where a woman talked about, I believe it was her sister wouldn't let a white person on her property because she was so bitter at having lost someone right on the eve of the Civil War. And so 70 years later, of course, that pain is still fresh. That wound is still raw. And Formerly enslaved people who were interviewed as part of this project remembered really striking details about their sales during the Civil War. One woman who had lived near on the Chattahoochee River in Georgia remembered very specifically that she had lost family members to the slave trade to raise money so that her enslaver could hire a substitute and get out of the Confederate Army. And that, clearly was something that still stung and still really, really hurt decades later. And so, while there are problems, while there certainly are pitfalls, let's say, in using these narratives as historical sources, there's still a great deal of power that comes through as people remember specific, and especially as they recall, very specific events.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that if one uses the narratives with the knowledge of
Mhm.
what they are and makes accommodations for those, they can be very, very valuable for what you can get from them.
Well, and it's a place where I try very carefully not to rest anything purely on one of those narratives, but in many cases they're strongly correlated by my other findings. And so what they do is they show that so for example, one enslaved man talked about how his one formerly enslaved man talked about how his enslaver sold him but wouldn't take Confederate money for him, and that tracks with the experiences of many people, and was borne out in other in letters and diaries and so forth. And so they certainly register the experience, but they also showed just how deeply aware enslaved people were of exactly what was happening during the Civil
Yeah.
War.
Yeah. Now, Robert, and certainly our fans at home know that we're a bookshop and we sell these books for you, but we're also an antiquarian bookshop. We sell artifacts of history and all the rest. That's one of our favorite things. And sometimes during these conversations, I like to bring out an artifact that helps illustrate something. And I think it's going to be kind of a surprise for you. But unfortunately, there's a bit of unfortunate news that I have to give to our customers that are watching. Usually I share an artifact that you can buy, and this photograph is a really fantastic photograph with an excellent story, which meant that one of you bought it just about as soon as we finished describing it and offering it to a customer. And that was between the time you and I agreed to do the interview and now
Oh
someone
wow.
bought this, so I can't offer this for sale because it's already gone to live in Tennessee. But let's look at a photograph that we had. And this is a wonderful large format albumin photograph of a Union cavalry colonel. You see his cavalry hat there in his saber. His name is Samuel Bowman, and Samuel Bowman is you use a lot of Samuel Bowman, but it's not that one. He's one of your slave traders, right?
Yeah.
Bowman and Bowman is
There's
one
a
of your
Richmond.
firms.
Yes.
That this is not
Yes.
that Samuel Bowman, but there he is, and he's in his uniform. And so this was a really great photograph, and someone bought it. But in researching this photograph, we found that Samuel Bowman, who's in this photograph, a colonel of cavalry, later receives an appointment as a brigadier general in the USCTs. And he goes, and his post is going to be Baltimore, and he's going to be in charge of recruiting for the United States colored troops in a slave state, in a slave city, and in a slave state where both slavery and the trade are still legal at that time. So I found a quote from Samuel Bowman, our Samuel Bowman, that I wanted to show the photo because I want to be able to share this quote with you. Bowman is talking about the difficulties in recruiting Black soldiers from amongst the population of people who are enslaved. And he writes to President Lincoln, um, uh, quote, "The prospects of recruiting colored men increase day by day. We have to contend against influences and rascalities more powerful and numerous than I had supposed. Hitherto slaves had been confined in jails for safekeeping, but I am acting as a sort of jail deliverer all over the state. Hence, the slaves are now hid in other places, are crowded onto secluded localities unapproachable by land, and others are out in boats pretending to carry on the oyster business, and so on." Then he ends, "I will soon as possible send out a piratical crew to board every oyster boat on the Chesapeake Bay and recruit other crews into the USCTs." So the question I have for you, first of all, I think that's hilarious,
It's
what
It's
Bowman is
amazing.
writing.
Yeah.
But okay, so expound from what you have learned. What is Bowman up against as someone who's trying to recruit USCT soldiers right out of the slave
Hmm.
jails, where it's
Hmm.
legal for them to be?
Yes, it is legal, and of course the law is complex and constantly evolving in a state like Maryland. But there are these repeated incidents where union I'll give you an example. There were two brothers who were slave traders, Walter and Bernard Campbell, and Walter ran their operation in New Orleans and Bernard ran it in Baltimore, and they moved people between them basically from Baltimore to New Orleans. That becomes impossible for the most part during the Civil War, right? Maryland is now on the other side of an international boundary. The coastwise slave trade, the movement of enslaved people along the coast of the United States, becomes virtually impossible thanks to the blockade fairly quickly. But what Bernard does do is he holds people in his jail. He essentially allows Marylanders to use his jail to hold people whom they are afraid will, at the early days of the war, run away, and in the later stages of the war, potentially join the United States colored troops. And at one point earlier, I believe in the summer of 1862, there was a riot of the people held in his jail try to break out and seize their freedom. And then in 1863, General Birney opens the jail and pretty much recruits all of the men held there straight into the United States colored troops. But what's telling, what I think is interesting, is that if you look at the men that Birney liberates from the jail, he actually has a recording of their alleged enslaver, and many of them are enslaved by a man named Greenleaf Johnson. Greenleaf Johnson, I'm pretty sure was smuggling them across the Potomac River into Virginia. So in some ways, the slave trade that Bernard Campbell engaged in for so long is largely defunct. But he on the Maryland side of the Union border is still trying to facilitate a trade in enslaved people, just now through the Confederate capital of Richmond. Johnson will eventually be arrested for trying to smuggle people across the lines, and Bernard Campbell pays his bail. So this is still it's still very real.
Yeah.
I should also notice I should also note what Bowman is talking about is also highly risky and highly contested. At least one Union officer or Maryland slaveholders murder at least one Union recruiter of USCTs. And the guy who murdered that recruiter flees across the Potomac, and lo and behold, finds himself trying to buy and sell people in Richmond.
Mhm.
So it's all sort of bound up together. Absolutely.
Right. Okay, we're just about to run out of time, which is too bad because I had like another hour worth of questions I wanted to ask. But I'm thank you for the folks at home that asked so many questions, and a large part of our discussion got to be answering your questions. I'm going to take one more look and see if there's any last minute questions. No, good. I get to I get to ask my questions at the end, which brings us to this, and this is the beginning of your book, Robert. And so I'm going to give you a chance to describe the picture, but what happened to this trade in humans even as the war came to an end? You open your book with an astonishing picture of Richmond, even as the city burns and Union troops who are Black are marching in. I mean, what's happening at the very end of the war?
Yeah. So, and I honestly, this is one of the things that helped put me onto the project, because this is one of the, I would say this is not an unknown story. It shows up in a number of histories of Richmond and Civil War. So the story that I open with is a former a slave trader named Robert Lumpkin, who operated a jail in Richmond. You can still see the site of his jail in Richmond if you get off I-95 in the middle of the city. I-95 actually goes right over the site of his jail, but portions of his facility are extant, and the city is doing various things with them. Robert Lumpkin tries to move 50 people out of his jail and send them south behind the cover of Lee's retreating army. And I find this incredibly arresting, because this is usually sort of shown as like, look at what the war is, and it doesn't work, I should say. Confederate officials will not let him on a train out of the city. They have sort of more pressing things on their mind,
Yeah.
getting government records and gold and things like that out of the city. But no one had ever really stopped and thought about, why is Lumpkin trying to do this? Why does he think that this will work? And yet, there I found a stunning number of examples of people who are buying enslaved people, while Lee is retreating from Petersburg to Appomattox, for example. And I just think that what it drives home, if nothing else, is how committed a broad swath of Confederates were to the preservation of the institution of slavery, and how hard the idea that an independent slaveholding republic might come into being and perpetuate the institution of slavery in the United States, how hard that idea died. And in some ways, that's what this book is about, is tracing how people reckoned with the possibilities of a slaveholding future, and how long Confederates denied or were in denial about the likelihood of that emergence, and then how enslaved people fought to prevent that from happening. In a nutshell, that's what the book is about.
Yeah. And I was wondering, I wondered to myself if that's a sort of tribute to the power of delusion that people have.
You can never underestimate it.
Yeah, how could people be pretending that the world would never change even as the city was burning around them? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So
Jim Rourke once said, in his sort of in his it's from his masterful book from the 70s, at one point sort of throws up in his hands and says something effective: you just can't underestimate how much how reluctant slaveholders were to imagine a world without slavery. And I think that that remains a powerful insight.
Yeah, even if they lived even while they were living in the world without slavery, they couldn't imagine.
Right.
Couldn't imagine it.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Robert K.D. Colby. And let me let me show everybody what we're talking about once again. It is An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. We have first edition copies available for you to buy. They will be signed, as Robert has signed our custom book plate for you. They're still going to be available. They're still available now, and they will be available after the event. So if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, it will still be available for you to buy. Now, let me tell everybody just a little bit about what we're expecting in the near future on A House Divided. Now, we don't have anything on the calendar right now, but next month, Savas Beatty Publishers is going to bring out the first of a series of books that David Powell is writing about the Atlanta campaign, a new military history of the Atlanta campaign. It's going to be fantastic. You remember that David wrote 3 books about the Chickamauga campaign, and now he's handling the Atlanta campaign. It's going to be fantastic. We don't have a date yet, but it'll probably be about the second week of July. We need to make sure we have the books published and available to send to you. But keep an eye on this site. We will continue to announce new events all through the fall, and there's some really great books coming up. Also, remember that Eric Larson's The Demon of Unrest. We have that in first edition, and you're still buying it, and it's still, it's a wonderful book, first edition and signed. You can order that, and we will send it right out to you. Before we go, Robert, you've got this book out. You know, there it is. Do you have a plan now, or just teaching?
Well, I'm actually, yeah. So I'm trying to build out the story of a man I came across in this book, who fled Richmond during the Civil War because he feared being sold, which was a very common story, and he becomes an anti-slavery activist during the Civil War and a minister during Reconstruction. And so my hope is to write a sort of micro history about his life and experiences.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing it. Thank you,
I am too.
everybody. Thank you, everybody at home, for watching A House Divided. And thank you to Robert for joining us. And we will see all of you next time